The Hall of Accord was designed to humble anyone who entered it. That was not symbolism. It was policy. The chamber had been carved into the interior of a hollow mountain on Ilar Prime, seat of the Concordance Assembly, and every part of it had been built to remind delegates that institutions outlived the people who served them. The ceiling arched so high it disappeared into a haze of pale luminescence. The walls were layered with memory glass that retained the heat signatures of every speaker who had ever stood before the assembly. Beneath the delegates' feet, the black floor reflected them with enough clarity to feel accusatory. Ambassador Lena Vale had stood in that chamber 12 times. She had never hated it as much as she did now. She stood at Earth's podium, hands loosely clasped behind her back, shoulders level, face composed into the professional stillness diplomacy required. To her left and right, in rising rings of tiered seating, sat representatives of 32-member civilizations. Some were present in person: towering avian Celt, silver-skinned Mirati, the segmented stone-bodied Tan, the translucent Vey who spoke through vibrating sacs along their throats. Others appeared by projection, light forms flickering at their assigned stations from systems too distant for direct travel. All of them were waiting. None of them looked surprised. That was the part Lena could not stop noticing. Not one face in the chamber carried the uncertainty of people about to decide something difficult. Their expressions had already settled into the hard, ceremonial patience of those attending the formal reading of a conclusion reached elsewhere. High Moderator Selvek, presiding from the central dais, adjusted the folded sleeves of his white and gold office robes and looked down at the chamber with all the warmth of polished stone. "The matter before the assembly," he said in the trade tongue, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustic fields into perfect clarity, "concerns the unauthorized contact event initiated by the Earth survey vessel Meridian and the improper interference that followed in the licensed Karsus extraction zone." Lena kept her eyes on him. She knew every word that would come next. She had spent the last 3 months learning the case so thoroughly that she could recite it without notes, even now, even angry. The Meridian had been conducting a spectrographic survey on the outer edge of the Karsus belt, a cluster of mineral-rich moons under lease to Heliox Industrial Concern. Heliox held all the correct licenses, all the proper seals, all the legal rights afforded by the Concordance for resource extraction in non-sentient biological zones. Then Meridian's xenobiologist, Dr. Arun Mehta, found the people Heliox's scans had missed. Not because the scans failed. Because the scans had only looked for intelligence in the shapes the Concordance recognized. The Athari lived beneath the crust of Karsus 4, woven through thermal caverns and branching networks of crystal root growth. They did not speak with sound. They did not forge metal. They did not build cities visible from orbit. They communicated through pulses of light transmitted through living mineral structures. Memory, language, law, ancestry, warning, grief, all carried in sequences so complex that Dr. Mehta had spent 9 weeks sleeping in the caverns beside them before he could understand even fragments of what they were saying. When he finally did, the first thing they showed him was pain. Images transferred through light and heat into his sensor veil. The drill heads, the fractures, the collapse of ancestral vaults, the dead buried in broken crystal that had stored centuries of communal memory. Meridian filed an emergency sentience claim. Earth filed an extraction injunction. Heliox filed a countersuit within 6 hours. And the assembly moved with a speed it had never once granted to any case involving ethics. Lena had understood the reason for that speed too late. Heliox supplied reactor compounds to 5-member species. The Ethics Review Commission that dismissed Earth's claim had 3 chairing civilizations with direct commercial partnerships tied to Heliox's routes. The verdict had been written before she entered the chamber. Selvek continued, tone calm and bloodless. The contact made by Meridian personnel was conducted without oversight, without assembly authorization, and within an active licensed zone. As the indigenous biological structures in question remain classified under non-sentient substrate category designation, the resulting Earth complaint is ruled inadmissible at origin. No one moved. No one objected. Lena heard, very distantly, the faint hiss of one of the environmental tanks cycling atmosphere for a methane-breathing delegate 3 rows up. She thought, this is what institutional violence sounds like when it wears etiquette. Selvek lowered his gaze to the final page. Furthermore, he said, Earth's unilateral interference with lawful extraction in a recognized commercial zone constitutes a violation of Concordance Charter Article 9, Sections 2 and 4. A motion has therefore been advanced for temporary suspension of Earth's voting privileges, route access, and relay authority pending formal review. Temporary. That word was always where systems like this hid the knife. Lena did not turn her head, but she could feel the small Earth delegation behind the gallery glass go absolutely still. Selvek nodded once to the chamber clerk. "The motion will be read." It was read. It took less than a minute. Then the voting lattice ignited in blue-white lines across the black floor. One by one the member stations lit. Approval. 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 A few took longer than others, performing thoughtfulness for the record, but the result never changed. When the final tally appeared, the numbers hovered above the chamber in cold light. 32 in favor, 1 opposed. Earth's vote had been recorded. It had not counted. Suspended members lost procedural standing the moment suspension was called. The system allowed the target of the vote to participate only for the sake of appearances. Lena had once admired that rule for its elegance. Now she understood elegance was often just cruelty that had been organized. Selvek folded his hands. Earth's assembly privileges are suspended effective immediately. Relay access will be revoked within 6 standard hours. Intersystem transit priority is rescinded. Shared medical, trade and logistical licensing is paused pending formal review. A review hearing has been scheduled. He named the date. 30 years. Not a prison sentence. Worse. A bureaucratic burial. Something shifted in Lena's chest then. Not quite rage, not quite grief, but something colder and far more durable than either. The kind of feeling that did not flare. The kind that settled. Protocol allowed one final statement for the record from a suspended delegation. Selvek looked at her. "You may speak." Lena stepped toward the voice ring embedded in the podium. For a moment she said nothing. She let herself look at them, all of them, the ancient species, the old institutions, the careful faces of civilizations that had convinced themselves they were wise because they had survived long enough to mistake habit for justice. Then she spoke. "What?" she asked, her voice perfectly steady. "Do you call a people whose language exists in a form you never bothered to hear?" No one answered. Not Selvek. Not the chamber. Not the 32 civilizations seated under 7,000 years of accumulated law. The silence was total. And in that silence, Lena finally understood the real danger of the concordance. It was not that it was cruel. It was that it had become so certain of its own definitions that anything beyond them no longer sounded like a voice. She gathered her documents, turned from the podium, and walked out beneath the weight of the shining ceiling without once looking back. Behind her, the Hall of Accord remained exactly what it had always been. Ancient, beautiful, and deaf. "Send phase 2 when you're ready." The shuttle back to Earth's diplomatic vessel felt smaller than usual. Not physically. Physically, it was the same narrow transfer craft Lena Vale had used a dozen times before. 6 seats, gray walls, safety lights running in muted strips along the ceiling, the faint recycled metal smell of every official transport ever built by committee. But humiliation has a way of reducing available space. By the time the hatch sealed behind her, the cabin felt like a box built for transporting fragile things that had already cracked. No one spoke during the flight. Her junior aide, Tomas Aaron, sat across from her with a data slate resting uselessly in both hands. He was 28, brilliant, and still young enough to believe that institutions usually corrected themselves if you explained the facts clearly enough. The last 2 hours had likely been expensive for him in ways no salary scale accounted for. He looked at her once, opened his mouth, then closed it again. Lena appreciated that. The transfer shuttle docked with the ECS Resolute 12 minutes later. The airlock cycled. Earth crew in diplomatic blues stood ready to receive the delegation, each of them trained too well to ask questions before their superiors had chosen how to fall apart. Lena stepped through, handed her document case to no one and said only, "I need 10 minutes. They gave them to her. The communications room at the rear of the vessel was soundproofed, windowless, and painted in the sort of neutral matte gray that designers claimed reduced cognitive strain. Lena had always found it ugly. Tonight she found it merciful. She sat. For a full minute she did nothing. Then she placed both hands flat against the edge of the console and breathed once, slow and deliberate, until the tremor in her fingers stopped. On the wall display, the concordance relay clock continued its silent count toward revocation. 5 hours 42 minutes and 11 seconds. 5 hours 42 minutes before Earth's priority access codes went dead. After that, every transmission to Earth would move at ordinary light lag through a network they no longer belonged to. Weeks for the nearest colonies. Months for the farther chains. The concordance never needed fleets first. It had paperwork for that. Lena closed her eyes and saw Karsus 4. Not because she had ever been there. Because she had read Dr. Mehta's reports so many times that his descriptions now lived in her like memory. The underground crystal groves. The Athari light webs. The shattered vaults where Heliox's drills had punched into living archives that the assembly had dismissed as mineral irregularity. She thought of one passage from Meta's testimony, a line the Ethics Review Commission had ignored entirely. They understood what was happening to them long before we understood they were speaking. Lena opened her eyes. The relay clock dropped another second. She keyed the secure channel directory manually. Not because the system required it. Because some messages deserved the dignity of being built by hand. Recipient, Admiral Naomi Sato, Unified Defense Coordination Authority Priority, Black Encryption, Sovereign. The text field opened. Lena looked at it for several seconds. Any ordinary report would take pages. Legal summaries. Route impacts. Trade implications. Relay degradation. Probable supply collapse across the outer settlements. Medical license suspensions. Colonial exposure timelines. Strategic recommendations. There was no time for pages. And Naomi Sato was not a woman who needed pages to understand a battlefield. Lena typed 4 words. They closed the door. She read it once. Then she sent it. The transmission left the Resolute at 1814 shipboard time. It would reach Lunar Command a little under 4 minutes later. Lena leaned back in her chair after sending it, suddenly and profoundly tired. Not defeated. That would have been easier. Defeat implied finality. A clean end. A shape one could accept. This was worse. This was subtraction. A civilized amputation. Earth had not been declared an enemy. It had been reclassified as inconvenient. The console chimed once. An acknowledgement had returned almost instantly, relay still live then. It contained no greeting. No formal receipt. No sympathy. Just a single encrypted attachment. Lena frowned and opened it. Inside was a scanned page of old paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, marked by a handwritten code designation she did not recognize. Contingency 9. Beneath it, in neat dark ink, someone had written a single sentence. If they ever decide we are alone, make certain they regret how well we listened while they were speaking. Lena stared at the line for a long moment. Then, despite everything, despite the chamber and the vote and the 30 years and the cold machinery of official abandonment, she smiled. Small. Sure. Not because the situation had improved. Because somewhere on Earth, Naomi Sato had opened a drawer. And drawers like that did not exist in governments built on hope. They existed in governments built by people who had been counting the exits since the day they were invited inside. A knock sounded at the door. Tomas's voice came through the panel, careful and controlled. Ambassador? Lena rose, smoothed the front of her jacket and keyed the door. Tomas stood outside, face pale but steadier now. The crew is ready for departure, he said. Command is requesting full status as soon as you can transmit. Lena stepped into the corridor. Behind her, on the wall display inside the room, the relay countdown kept moving. 5 hours 31 minutes and 2 seconds. She looked at Tomas, at the young diplomat trying very hard to stand like someone who had not just watched the galaxy's oldest institution show him exactly what it thought of people like him. Set course for home, she said. He nodded. Then, because he was still young enough to need the question answered plainly, he asked, "What happens now?" Lena thought of the line Naomi had sent back. Of old paper in a hidden drawer. Of Karsisk 4. Of crystal memory shattered by people who called themselves civilized. Her expression did not change. Now, she said, we find out what they taught us while we were busy asking to belong. The first system to fail was not military. It was medical. That was how Lena learned the real shape of the Concordance. Not through fleets at the edge of human space. Not through threats broadcast across public channels. But through a report waiting on Admiral Naomi Sato's desk 12 hours after the relay lights went gray. 41 pharmaceutical syntheses used by Earth and the outer colonies depended on Concordance licensing trees. Not the base chemistry itself. Human labs understood most of that well enough. But the distributed manufacturing permissions, the supply routing algorithms, the molecular refinement templates locked behind shared infrastructure agreements Earth no longer had access to. Which meant that at 6 o'clock the previous morning, a line of legal text had become an interruption in pediatric oncology on Callisto, organ stabilization therapy in the Titan clinics, antifungal treatments in 3 agricultural habitats, and a dozen specialized compounds used in frontier trauma wards. The report was not dramatic. Naomi preferred reports that were not dramatic. Drama wasted time. The first page contained projected stockpile durations. Some were measured in months. A few were measured in weeks. 3 were measured in days. Naomi read every line once, then once again, then forwarded the file to 8 departments with the same note attached. Do not tell me why this is difficult. Tell me how soon it stops being a problem. That was Monday. By Thursday, Earth's Biomedical Directorate had converted 2 research campuses, 1 defense fabrication annex, and a civilian synth farm outside Cape Town into an emergency distributed production network. The legal office filed a memorandum noting that reverse engineering concordance-protected synthesis chains would technically violate 30 years of shared regulatory agreements. Naomi sent back one sentence. They may submit a complaint through the usual channels. Production began 6 hours later. It was like that all across human space. Not panic. On Luna, Dock Superintendent Elias Varon was woken before dawn by a priority call from Orbital Logistics Command and went to bed 2 days later in the same clothes, having forgotten 3 meals and 1 scheduled physical therapy appointment. He was 63, broad-handed, permanently sleep-deprived, and had spent most of his adult life building cargo frames, patrol hulls, fuel tenders, and anything else the yards required on ugly schedules and uglier budgets. When Naomi's office sent over the first colonial resupply projections, he stood on the assembly floor of Lunar Yard 3 and stared at the schematics for 6 full minutes without saying anything. His chief foreman, Jiawen, waited him out. She had worked with him for 14 years and knew silence in Elias was not confusion. It was mathematics occurring behind the face. Finally he pointed to the nearest hull frame, a half-finished mid-range transport built for ordinary convoy work. Strip the luxury allocation, he said. Jia blinked. It doesn't have a luxury allocation. Then strip whatever passes for one. He crossed to the wall display and called up the fuel geometry. These tanks are too small. For what? For reality, Elias said. By evening, the yard had suspended 12 commercial projects, reassigned 400 workers, cannibalized 2 export contracts that no longer mattered, and redrawn an entire quarter's production schedule around a single ugly truth. Without concordance relays, every colony route Earth had treated as inconveniently long was now simply the route. The first redesigns looked ridiculous. Bulbous fuel sections. Narrow crew blocks. Cargo cores packed so hard the structural tolerances complained. No one in the yard loved them. That helped. Ships people loved were often overthought. Ships built by angry engineers in strategic disgrace had a way of becoming unforgettable. Jia took to calling them bricks with aspirations, which was unfair. They were slower than concordance freight lanes. Cruder too. But they were simple, durable, and built around one requirement alone. They had to go farther than anything Earth had ever needed before, and they had to do it without asking anyone's permission. Lena watched much of this through reports while the Resolute made its long return crawl toward home. That too had become part of the lesson. Earth's diplomats had spent 4 decades learning the language of membership. Procedure, hierarchy, coalition, deference, timing. What none of them had fully grasped until now was how much of civilization's ordinary functioning had been quietly outsourced to systems controlled by people who had never truly believed humans belonged inside them. The outer colonies understood faster. They always did. On Aster Reach, rationing began before the formal directive arrived, because the settlement's quartermaster had seen the supply graph flatten and trusted mathematics more than politics. On Pelagos Station, 2 hydroponics chiefs merged crop schedules without waiting for central approval. On Nineglass, the Emergency Council reopened decommissioned machine shops and started fabricating replacement filtration components from archived designs older than Lena herself. Nobody called it patriotism. That would have been too clean. It was closer to species memory. The sudden recollection that for most of human history, survival had not depended on fairness. It had depended on adaptation, speed, and a slightly unhealthy willingness to keep functioning while offended. Naomi visited Lunar Yard 3 on the 10th day after suspension. She did not travel with photographers or speechwriters. She brought one aide, a sealed tablet, and the kind of expression that made junior officers stand straighter without knowing why. Elias met her on the floor beneath the half-lit ribcage of the first new long-haul transport. She looked up at it. "It'll hold?" she asked. Elias followed her gaze. "It'll fly," he said. That wasn't the question. He considered, then nodded once. "Yes. It'll hold." Naomi handed him the tablet. Inside was the updated colonial risk map. 14 settlements marked in amber and red. Transit windows. Stockpile depletion curves. Projected delay tolerances. Elias read in silence. Then he gave the tablet back. "We'll need more fuel efficiency than these engines can currently give us," he said. "And we'll need crews who don't scare easy." "Get the first," Naomi said. "I'm already finding the second." She turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at the half-built transport. What are you calling it? Elias frowned. Didn't know we were naming cargo. We are now. He looked at the raw hull, the exposed conduits, the oversized tanks that made the whole ship look faintly improbable. Then he said, Endeavor. Naomi's mouth twitched, almost a smile though not quite. Good, she said. Build me 20. By the third week, everyone on Earth understood the truth the Concordans had intended them to learn through punishment. Isolation was supposed to make them smaller. Instead, it was teaching them what had always been theirs to build. The first ally did not arrive at Earth through diplomacy. She arrived broken, drifting, and broadcasting a distress code no one had any legal reason to answer. The Endeavor was 21 days into its first deep route run when the signal appeared. Captain Mira Anwar saw it on the forward tactical display as a thin amber line flickering across the edge of local scan. Old Concordance emergency protocol, degraded by static, repeating every 11 seconds from somewhere inside a region of chart space so badly mapped that half its hazard markers were still tagged survey incomplete. Mira had 300 tons of medical synthesis stock, replacement reactor seals, and water reclamation membranes in her hold, all of it bound for the colony at Bright Hollow, where 2 clinics had already exhausted their last shipment of licensed anti-rejection compounds and were now running on dosage improvisations no physician enjoyed signing off on. She was not, by regulation or common sense, required to investigate. Earth was no longer under Concordance rescue obligation. More importantly, the Endeavor was not a patrol ship. She was a long-haul transport held together by brutal engineering, overloaded fuel geometry, and the kind of stubborn optimism Elias Varon insisted counted as a design philosophy. Mira looked at the distress signal for 7 seconds. Then she said, "Bring us around." Her navigator turned in his chair. "Captain, we're already behind schedule." "I noticed." "The cargo will still matter in 20 minutes, Mira said. "If this is real, they may not." That was the thing about newly isolated civilizations. They remembered very quickly what sort of people they wanted to be when no one was grading them. The damaged vessel came into view 12 minutes later. It was not a design anyone on Earth's registry recognized. Long, narrow, and curved like something grown instead of assembled, with one drive section dark, one stabilizer fin half torn away, and its outer skin patched in at least 4 visibly different materials. The ship looked old in the way some tools looked old, not neglected but repaired so many times that repair itself had become its final architecture. No weapons lock. No active targeting fields. Just a distress beacon and the quiet, exhausted tumble of a ship that had run out of better options. Mira opened a broad-spectrum channel. "Unidentified vessel," she said. "This is Earth Transport Endeavor. We read your emergency signal. State your status." The reply took long enough that for a moment she thought either the translator was failing or the crew on the other ship had decided silence was safer. Then a voice came through. Measured. Female perhaps. Filtered through an older translation lattice with just enough delay to make every sentence sound carefully assembled. "This is the Wayfarer of Glass," the voice said. "Primary drive lattice fractured. Reserve power failing. We did not expect an answer." Mira leaned forward slightly. "That makes 2 of us," she said. "Do you have injured?" "A manageable number. What we require first is power stabilization." "Food or fuel?" Mira asked. There was a pause on the line. Long enough to feel like surprise. Then the voice answered, more softly this time. "Fuel." Mira cut the channel and turned to her engineering chief. "Docking collar prep. Portable transfer rig first. We stabilize them before we ask questions." Her chief nodded once and was already moving before she finished. The operation took 4 hours. 4 cramped, careful, ugly hours in the dark between half-charted stars, with the Endeavor locked to the wounded stranger ship by a collar that complained the entire time and engineers on both sides speaking mostly through diagrams, hand signals, and the shared international language of people trying to stop machinery from dying. Mira crossed over only once the transfer lines were stable. The Wayfarer of Glass smelled faintly of hot metal and something resinous, almost floral under the ozone. Its corridors were narrow and ribbed with translucent support arches that glowed from stored charge. Several had gone dim. Emergency strips along the floor pulsed in slow blue intervals, like an exhausted heartbeat. Its captain met her halfway to engineering. She was taller than Mira by a head, thin-framed, silver-brown skinned, with eyes so dark they seemed almost reflective. Fine branching marks traced along her temples and throat like living calligraphy. Her expression held the formal stillness of someone prepared at any moment to be treated as unwelcome. "I am Turin Sol," she said. "Mira Anwar." Turin inclined her head once. You are human. That's usually how these conversations go. Something flickered at the corner of Turin's mouth. Not quite amusement. Recognition maybe. They walked together toward the ruptured drive compartment. Your signal used concordance emergency bands, Mira said. Yes. You expected a concordance vessel? No, Turin said. We expected to be ignored by one. That answer stayed with Mira the rest of the corridor. The damage itself was ugly but reparable. A fractured containment throat, power backwash through the secondary conduits, and a drive regulator that had failed at exactly the wrong moment in exactly the wrong part of space. Myra's engineer, still crouched half inside an open-access panel, looked up as she approached and gave her the universal expression of a technician who had moved past complaint into focused resentment. We can fabricate the throat seal, he said. But it'll cost us 6 hours. Mira glanced toward Turin. Do it. Turin studied her face as if looking for the hidden invoice beneath the decision. There will be none, Mira said before she could ask. That is unusual. So I'm learning. While the repair crews worked, they shared coffee in the Endeavor's galley, because human ships solved more diplomatic openings with hot drinks than any academy would ever admit. Turin held the metal cup in both long-fingered hands and watched the steam with the wary concentration of someone not used to being offered comfort before negotiation. Your people are the ones the concordance suspended, she said at last. Mira nodded. You heard. We hear many things out here, Turin replied. The routes beyond the relays carry stories faster than they carry freight. Then you know we're having a difficult month. Turin's gaze lifted to hers. 43 years ago, she said, the concordance classified my people as non-territorial transients and removed our navigation claims from 3 corridor systems we had maintained for 6 centuries. They told us we did not build permanent enough things to merit recognition. Mira said nothing. There are moments when interruption is just another form of arrogance. Turin continued, voice flat with age-smoothed anger. We appealed. The review was scheduled. Then delayed. Then revised. Then archived into a category called pending civil clarification. We have been waiting 19 years for clarification. Mira looked down into her coffee. There was again. Not an isolated injustice. A pattern. The same machine, the same tone, the same elegant violence dressed as administrative patience. When the repair was complete, Turin stood with Mira at the docking collar before separation. You have lost much, she said. So have you. Yes, Turin said. Which is why this matters. She handed Mira a data crystal no longer than a finger joint. What is it? Routes, Turin said. Long path charts. Dead zones. Drift corridors. Anchor shadows. Places the concordance never mapped because its relay lanes made them unnecessary. Mira stared at the crystal. This covers how much space? Enough, Turin said, to stop believing the roads they built were the only roads that existed. For the first time since the Endeavor had found the distress signal, Mira felt something inside her shift. Not relief. Something better. Possibility. Turin, she said slowly, why give this to us? The other captain looked past her, through the still open collar, toward the patched hull of her own wounded ship and the ugly human transport that had stopped when it didn't have time to stop. Because, she said, the concordance is very old and old systems often mistake neglect for wisdom. Anyone they shut outside the door eventually learns where the walls are thin. She inclined her head once more. You answered. Then the collar disengaged. The Wayfarer of glass slipped back into the dark on a repaired drive and borrowed fuel, and the Endeavor turned again toward Bright Hollow carrying medicine, delay, and something far more dangerous than cargo. A map. Not just through space. Through abandonment. When Mira transmitted the chart package home on slowband priority, Naomi Sato received it 6 days later with a single line attached. We may not be alone outside the system. By the time Trinsal's route crystal reached Earth, Lena Vale was home. Home did not feel the way it used to. That was not because Earth had changed while she was gone. Earth, in the broad physical sense, remained stubbornly itself. Oceans, cities, traffic, weather systems, orbital congestion, political argument, bad coffee and government buildings. What had changed was the angle from which she saw it. For 43 years, humanity had thought of itself as a junior member inside a very large house. Now Lena could not stop noticing how many doors in that house had always been locked. Her official title remained Ambassador Extraordinary to the Concordance, which had become faintly absurd in the way bureaucratic language often did under pressure. There was no Concordance post to return to, no assembly chamber waiting, no procedural ladder left to climb. In practical terms, her work had become something harder to define and far more useful. She read. She read the way some people built barricades. The archives Earth still possessed. Public records, copied committee filings, trade motions, classification disputes, rejected appeals, procedural challenges, review petitions, emergency stays, corridor claims, had never seemed especially alive when the Concordance was functioning normally. They had simply been bureaucracy, the paper smell skeleton beneath galactic governance. Now Lena read them as evidence. And once she started, she could not stop. The pattern was everywhere. Species denied recognition because their cognition did not fit Concordance testing structures. Corridor communities reclassified as transient populations when their routes intersected profitable lanes. Smaller member blocks folded into combined representation until their votes became statistics. Appeals delayed not by explicit refusal but by procedural extension, technical revision, archival transfer, or any of the 1,000 bloodless tools old institutions used when they wanted someone to vanish politely. She built maps. One screen tracked formal expulsions. One tracked indefinite review cases. One marked restricted civilizational status, which was the Concordance phrase for we know you are there but do not intend to deal with you honestly. A fourth map she built for herself with no official label at all. It was simply titled, Everyone They Left Outside. Naomi Sato found her 3 weeks later in a requisitioned office in Nairobi Administrative Sector 3, surrounded by stacked printouts, glowing screens, and the organized chaos of a person well past the point of pretending she might rest soon. Naomi stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Lena glanced up. You always do that like an accusation, she said. I was deciding whether this counts as research or obsession. Lena turned back to the nearest display. Those are usually adjacent. Naomi stepped inside. On the central wall screen, 87 markers glowed in yellow, amber, and red. She read the categories in silence. Then she said, That's a great many people. Yes. Some of these are older than Earth's membership. Yes. You think the Concordance built itself on this? Lena leaned back in her chair and finally looked at her. No, she said. I think the Concordance built itself around this. That landed. Naomi moved closer to the screens. Her eye tracked across names, corridor codes, status designations, collapsed appeal histories. You're not just counting injustices, she said after a moment. You're looking for infrastructure. Lena almost smiled. Of course I am. The first ally had been an accident of distress and decency. Trinsal's route maps had proven a simple, dangerous truth. The galaxy beyond Concordance lanes was not empty. It was merely undercounted, underheard, and forced to become self-sufficient in ways respectable civilizations had never needed to understand. Lena intended to find the rest. The Concordance made one major assumption, she said. It believed exclusion isolates. That if they cut us off from the official structure, we would spend our energy trying to get back in. And you want to spend that energy elsewhere. I want to find out how many others learned to survive after being told they were too small, too irregular, too inconvenient, too difficult to classify, or too expensive to matter. Naomi folded her arms. And if you find them? Lena reached to her desk and picked up a paper document. Actual paper. Naomi noticed that immediately. Because screens encourage revision, Lena said. And this needs to stay short. She handed it over. It was 11 pages. Naomi read the first line. Then the second. Then she went back and read the first again. No grand title. No ornamental language. No ceremonial preamble. Just plain text. Agreement between signatory peoples for mutual recognition, transit, exchange, and defense. Naomi looked up. You wrote a charter. I wrote the beginning of one. You think they'll sign it? I think, Lena said carefully, that if your entire political existence has been defined by being footnoted, delayed, combined, reclassified, or patronized, then the offer of simple equal standing might be more persuasive than another invitation to wait. Naomi turned the first page. Article 1 was only a paragraph long. No signatory may classify another people as lesser-minded, pre-civil, non-sentient, or developmentally insufficient except by standards agreed upon jointly and reviewed openly. The burden of proof belongs to the classifier, never the classified. Naomi read it twice. Direct, she said. It needs to be. The Concordance Charter is 9,000 pages. 9,000 pages is how a system gives itself room to pretend it did not hear what was clearly said. She took the document back and tapped its top edge against the desk to straighten it. I'm not trying to build a better version of them, she said. I'm trying to build something harder to hide inside. Naomi was quiet for several seconds. This was how she thought when the question mattered. without movement, without performance, letting the full geometry of the thing settle. Finally she asked, "Who first?" Lena turned one screen toward her. A route cluster bloomed open, built partly from Trinsal's charts and partly from old commercial references that concordance systems had long since marked as economically irrelevant. "The corridor houses," Lena said. "Independent route communities with no formal recognition but enough ship traffic to matter. The Serev enclave on the inner dark lanes. The Kal Combine if they're still functioning. And the Talari caravans, if their registry collapse wasn't as complete as the records suggest." Naomi nodded once. "You're talking about a shadow network." "I'm talking about the people who kept moving after official maps stopped drawing them." Outside the office windows, afternoon rain streaked the glass in silver lines. Below, Nairobi traffic crawled in luminous threads between towers and tramways and rooftop gardens. Earth went on doing what Earth always did, failing in local ways, adapting in practical ones, surviving largely through momentum and argument. Naomi looked from the rain to the 11 pages. "If you leave," she said, "you won't be traveling as an Earth envoy." "I know. You'll need route papers. Civilian cover. Probably at least 2 plausible identities, one of which we hope never gets examined too closely." "I know. Some of this is technically espionage." Lena tilted her head. "Only if someone worth respecting complains." That got the smallest trace of a laugh from Naomi, which on her counted as near celebration. Then Naomi's expression settled again. "If you do this," she said, "do it correctly. No speeches. No grand coalition announcements. No symbolic nonsense." Lena gestured to the 11 pages. "Have I seemed symbolic to you lately?" "No," Naomi admitted. "You've seemed dangerous." "Good." 3 days later, Lena Vale left Earth under the name Mara Ven, listed in civilian transit records as a supply chain consultant specializing in long-route logistics for marginal corridor economies. The identity was not entirely false, which made it stronger. She traveled on Serev documents arranged through Trinsal's network and boarded a patched commercial hauler whose crew asked no questions beyond payment and destination. In her case sat 12 changes of clothing, 3 data slates, 1 encrypted narrowband transmitter, and 11 printed pages. By the time the hauler cleared the outer traffic lanes, Earth was already shrinking behind her into blue curve and cloud. She watched until the planet became just another bright body against the dark. Then she opened the case, took out the pages, and began again at Article 1. Because if she had learned anything from the Hall of Accord, it was this. If a system becomes powerful enough, it starts mistaking its own categories for reality. And the only serious answer to that mistake is to build a place where the unheard are expected to arrive. By the time the first convoy was stopped, Lena had been traveling under the name Mara Ven for 9 months. Long enough to forget what it felt like to move through a port without checking who was watching. Long enough to collect signatures from peoples the concordance had filed away under categories like marginal transit cultures, provisional enclaves, combined corridor entities, and other phrases meant to sound administrative instead of insulting. Trinsal's route houses had signed first. The Serev enclave followed after 2 days of negotiation and 1 night of shared maps spread across the floor of a cargo office that smelled like machine oil and burnt sugar. The Kal Combine took longer not because they disagreed with the 11 pages, but because they had spent 3 generations learning that promises from larger powers usually contained a hidden second contract somewhere in the margins. Lena had given them the document, answered every question directly, and then sat in silence while they read it a second time. At the end, their eldest trade speaker had looked up and said, "It is very short." "Yes," Lena had replied. "That is unusual. So is being told the truth in the same language it was written." They signed. By the start of the 10th month, the agreement still had no official ceremonial name. It had not needed one. Among the signatories it was simply being called the Compact, partly because the document was short and partly because every species involved understood instinctively that anything meant to survive had to fit inside ordinary speech. The Compact had no capital. No grand assembly hall. No fixed anthem, seal, or uniform. What it had instead was routes. Shared routes. Emergency routes. Medical routes. Quiet routes. Fuel swaps, translation exchanges, escort understandings, signal standards, dead drop points, cross-recognition papers, and one growing truth the concordance had still not fully accepted. People the system pushed to the edges learned the edges better than the center ever could. The convoy Lena was traveling with carried respiratory cultures and mineral bond antibiotics from a Serev fabrication node to a Kal settlement orbiting the dead red star Narrow. The outbreak on Narrow's third station wasn't catastrophic yet, but it was trending in the sort of direction that turned medical caution into triage if ignored long enough. There were 3 ships in convoy: a Serev carrier, a Talari escort cutter, and the old patched freighter Lena was on, running under civilian cargo consultancy credentials that had so far remained beneath formal scrutiny. Formal scrutiny arrived at 3:12 shipboard time in the form of a Concordance patrol cruiser sliding out from behind a dust-shadowed moon and locking them with administrative authority before weapons authority. That was the Concordance way. First came the signal burst. Then the identity challenge. Then the route violation notice. Then the polite fiction that all of this was routine. The patrol vessel identified itself as Civic Enforcement Cruiser Halcyon Crest, operating under Concordance Transit Harmonization Authority. Lena, standing behind the freighter captain on the bridge, actually laughed when she heard that. The captain, a narrow-faced Talari civilian named Eska whose people had developed the cultural ability to appear offended and exhausted at the same time, glanced sideways at her. "Is something amusing?" "Yes," Lena said. "They're using a tax office title to stage an interdiction." The cruiser's transmission came through a second later, voice neutral and perfectly trained. "Unregistered convoy traffic. This is Civic Enforcement Cruiser Halcyon Crest. You are operating within a monitored corridor under provisional Concordance transit supervision. Cut drives and prepare for inspection. Cargo verification and detention review will follow." Eska muted the channel. "Detention review," she said flatly. "That usually means they keep us here until someone higher up decides the paperwork is no longer interesting." "How long?" "Days if we're lucky. Weeks if they are." Narrow Station did not have weeks. Lena stepped closer to the tactical display. The cruiser held position just outside collision tolerance, close enough to dominate, far enough to avoid the appearance of aggression. No hard weapons lock yet. That mattered. "Open the public legal archive," she said. Eska stared at her. "Now?" "Yes." "What exactly are you planning?" Lena's expression did not change. "I'm going to remind them that institutions are made of clauses before they are made of ships." The archive opened across the central display in layered blocks of Concordance transit law, most of which Eska had never bothered reading because no sane civilian did. Lena scanned 3 sections, rejected 2, and found what she was looking for in the humanitarian carriage subcode, buried under emergency freight precedents and corridor quarantine exemptions. There it was. Article 12, Transit Exception 4. Any vessel carrying verifiable epidemic countermeasure cargo to an at-risk population may petition immediate humanitarian passage review. Review authority supersedes routine corridor detention, provided the filing meets procedural completeness standards. Eska looked at her. "That still requires approval." "Yes," Lena said. "From mid-level administrators who dislike liability more than they dislike us." She keyed in the first filing field. Then the second. Then the outbreak certification from Narrow Station, already attached in convoy cargo records. Then the Serev lab authentication. Then the pathology crossmatch. Then the delivery urgency declaration. Her hands moved quickly but not frantically. She knew this section of the law because once, years ago, while still serving as Earth's junior delegate, she had read the entire humanitarian code annex on a 7-hour transit and memorized the ugly useful parts out of habit. Back then it had seemed like diligence. Now it looked more like preparation. "Transmit to whom?" Eska asked. Lena smiled faintly. "To the smallest office in the largest bureaucracy. They are always the most dangerous people in a system like this." The petition went out. 43 pages, all correctly formatted. All properly cited. All impossible to reject quickly without creating a record of why. The cruiser hailed them again. "Unregistered convoy, cut drives immediately or enforcement measures will follow." Lena unmuted the channel herself this time. "This convoy has submitted a humanitarian transit exception petition under Article 12, Transit Exception 4, she said, voice level and crisp in Concordance trade tongue. "Cargo contains verifiable epidemic countermeasure materials for an at-risk station population. Any detention pending review now creates direct administrative liability under your own emergency carriage law." There was a pause on the other end. A real one. Not technical delay. Surprise. When the patrol commander replied, the neutrality in his tone had become slightly brittle. "State your designation." "Civilian logistics consultant," Lena said. "With excellent reading habits." Eska made a choking sound beside her that might have been laughter attempting professionalism and failing. The review took 51 minutes. On the bridge of the freighter, no one sat down during any of it. Then the authorization arrived. Approved. Expedited humanitarian passage. Immediate release. The patrol cruiser cut its intercept posture and drifted back onto its own lane. No apology offered because institutions like the Concordance almost never apologized when procedure forced them to behave. They simply withdrew and pretended the law had worked as intended all along. The convoy moved. Only once the stars shifted back to forward motion did Eska look at Lena and say very quietly, "Who are you really?" Lena watched the patrol cruiser shrink behind them. "Someone," she said, "who got tired of watching them hide behind rules they no longer remembered how to use correctly." Then she looked toward Neril Station's route marker glowing ahead in the dark. And for the first time since the Hall of Accord, she felt something that might actually have been hope. The order reached Admiral Naomi Sato on the 63rd day of the Corridor campaign. It arrived through priority command channels, marked lawful, urgent, and strategically necessary, which were the three labels institutions most often used when they wanted to make something ugly sound responsible. Naomi read it once. Then again. Then she set it face down on her desk and looked through the long bridge window of the UDC bastion at the drift of distant stars beyond the hull. No one in the command room spoke. They all knew better than to interrupt her at moments like this. The target was Vare Station. Civilian registry. Commercial neutral. Population approximately 42,000 permanent residents, plus transient dock labor and trade traffic. Technically unaffiliated. Practically essential. Concordance patrol groups operating in the outer corridors had been using Vare's fuel depots, repair rings, and storage vaults as their forward sustainment point for the past 6 weeks. Every interdiction, every convoy stop, every slow tightening pressure the Concordance was trying to apply to the compact ran through that station. Without Vare, the patrol lines would collapse backward by at least 3 systems. The military assessment attached to the order was concise. A long-range precision strike on the station's fueling infrastructure would disable Concordance forward operations immediately. Secondary civilian casualties were assessed as acceptable within projected engagement norms. Naomi hated that phrase. Not because it was unusual. Because it was normal. She had spent 34 years in uniform and had watched entire strategic arguments built on the back of language like that. Acceptable. Contained. Proportionate. Necessary. Clean words. Useful words. Words that kept your hands from shaking while you signed off on the destruction of people who had never voted, never invaded, never decided anything except where to sleep and what to cook and whether to complain about maintenance delays in the residential ring. Commander Imani Rook stood across the desk from her, arms clasped behind her back. Operationally, Rook said carefully, it would work. Naomi did not look away from the stars. I know. The strike package is already staged. I know. The Executive Council expects confirmation within the hour. That finally made Naomi turn. Imani had served under her for 7 years. Long enough to understand that what looked like stillness in Naomi was not indecision. It was the final assembly of principle and mathematics into something survivable. What do the casualty projections actually say? Naomi asked. Rook did not touch the tablet in her hand. She knew the figures by memory. Best case, minimal residential breach. Worst case, catastrophic venting across 2 habitation bands if the fuel chain propagates through the eastern support lattice. Median. Rook paused. 6,000. The bridge remained very quiet. Naomi reached for the order again, lifted it, and reread the final authorization line as if repetition might improve it. It did not. She thought of Lena Vale in the Hall of Accord, asking a chamber full of powerful civilizations what they called a people whose language they had never bothered to hear. She thought of the Athari under Karsus, 4. She thought of the Compact's first article, written in plain language because plain language left fewer places for decent people to hide from themselves. And she thought, not for the first time, that war does not test whether you can be hard. War tests whether you can remain recognizable to yourself while being hard. What alternatives? Naomi asked. Rook inhaled once. There's a blockade option. Slower. More complicated. Requires 6 freighters, 3 escort hulls, and probably every pilot in the sector willing to fly on bad sleep. How effective? Operationally equivalent within 3 weeks. Civilian risk? Minimal if the station administration cooperates. Manageable even if it doesn't. Naomi leaned back in her chair. The blockade option had not been the preferred recommendation because it demanded patience, logistics, and exposure. A strike was cleaner on paper. Quicker to brief. Easier to explain to people far away from the impact zone. Paper, Naomi had discovered over the course of her life, was often where conscience went to die respectably. She keyed open a direct command channel. Patch me to Captain Petra Voss. Rook blinked once. Not surprise, just adjustment. She had already understood, perhaps before Naomi had spoken, which direction the decision was moving. The channel opened 30 seconds later. Petra Voss appeared on the screen from the bridge of the UDC dogged, older now than when she had first taken the long routes, sharper around the eyes, with the look of a woman who had been carrying other people's survival for long enough that it had settled into posture. Admiral. I need 6 mule freighters into Ver corridor. Every one of them loaded with nothing the station can ignore. Voss's eyes narrowed slightly as the geometry of the request snapped into place. You're not striking. No. A small silence. Then Voss asked the only question that mattered. How fast? 18 hours. Voss looked off-screen briefly, already doing route calculations in her head. I can give you 5 in 18, she said. 6 if one of them limps. Then let it limp. Voss nodded once. Understood. Naomi cut the channel and opened a reply to the Executive Council's strike order. The cursor blinked in the response field. Around her, the bridge crew moved carefully, all of them pretending not to hear history choosing its tone. Naomi typed. Blockade of Ver sustainment infrastructure initiated in lieu of kinetic strike. Operational degradation of Concordance forward capability projected equivalent within 3 weeks. Civilian casualty probability reduced to negligible. She read the line once. Then added a second. We are not who they decided we were. Imani Rook looked at the screen, then at Naomi. That sentence will not be appreciated. No, Naomi said. It will be recorded. She sent it. The response from the Executive Council arrived 4 hours later in 3 separate messages of escalating displeasure. Naomi read all 3, filed them under later, and walked onto the bridge just as the first blockade elements slid into formation on the edge of Ver's traffic perimeter. No shots fired. No glorious speech. Just freighters, escorts, route denial, fuel interception, customs pressure, docking control, and the slow suffocation of a war machine that had expected its enemy to become simpler under stress. It had misjudged them. Again. 2 days into the blockade, Ver Station's civilian governor opened negotiations. 5 days later, Concordance patrol groups were already falling back to longer resupply chains. 3 weeks after that, their outer corridor posture began to collapse. The compact had won the phase without turning a station full of ordinary people into an example. And Naomi, standing on the bridge of the bastion with the stars cold beyond the glass, allowed herself one brief and private thought. It was possible, after all, to survive a system's cruelty without inheriting its habits. The Concordance did not collapse. That disappointed a certain kind of person. There are always people, especially far from the work, who expect history to announce itself with fire, with statues falling, with fleets burning in visible orbit and old regimes cracking in a single clean moment that can be named afterward in documentaries and schoolbooks. But institutions like the Concordance did not break that way. They softened first. Then they hesitated. Then, only after a long refusal to admit what everyone could already see, they began to speak in the careful language of people looking for a way to survive their own certainty. The first sign was not military. It was procedural. 3 weeks after the Ver blockade forced the Concordance patrol groups to fall back from the outer corridors, a minor trade delegation from the Hest Combine filed a formal inquiry requesting clarification on compact transit status under shared humanitarian carriage law. On its own, that meant little. Member delegations filed inquiries constantly. Most disappeared into committee sediment and never came back out. But the Hest Combine had not filed its request through the ordinary review desk. It had filed directly to the Primary Coordination Secretariat. That meant someone inside the system wanted the question answered where others could see it. 2 days later, the Venn Collective, patient, quiet, rarely confrontational, and in possession of one full vote they had spent 8 centuries using with almost painful caution, submitted a second request, this one asking whether the continued exclusion of compact cargo from recognized relief corridors remained compatible with the Concordance's own revised emergency carriage statutes. The filing used neutral language. That made it more dangerous, not less. Neutral language in a political body was often just rebellion with better tailoring. By the end of the week, 4 more delegations had requested closed-door briefings on the status of Earth, the outer corridor engagements, and the legal basis for continued enforcement actions against compact shipping after the failure of the Ver operation. No one called it dissent. Not yet. The official language was still phrases like administrative concern, posture reassessment, and strategic clarification review. But Naomi Sato had spent too many years reading command summaries not to recognize a retreat when she saw one trying to disguise itself as inquiry. She sat in the briefing room aboard the Bastion, reviewing intelligence overlays from 5 systems as the latest intercept came through on narrowband relay. Rook placed the transcript on the table in front of her. "Back channel?" Naomi asked. Rook nodded. "From inside the Secretariat. Mid-level source, previously reliable. Message is authenticated." Naomi read the single translated paragraph in silence. The Concordance does not understand why pressure has increased while compliance has failed. Several members are asking whether Earth and the Compact intend eventual negotiation or permanent partition. A quiet conversation may be possible if initiated before the matter reaches public chamber debate. Naomi looked up. "A quiet conversation," she repeated. Rook's expression stayed neutral. "That's diplomatic for, we would like this problem to become someone else's briefing error before it becomes our fault." Naomi almost smiled. "Accurate." She stood and walked to the forward display, where corridor maps glowed in overlapping layers, compact routes in white, concordance patrol patterns in blue, interruption zones in amber, and the dead-long paths Turnsal's people had once flown unseen in silver thread lines through the dark. The map had changed. That was the point. 3 years ago most of those routes had existed only in forgotten charts, oral corridor memory, and communities the Concordance called peripheral because peripheral was easier to say than ignored. Now they carried medicine, machine parts, translators, seed stock, legal records, fuel, and enough mutual dependence to make anyone paying attention deeply uncomfortable. The Compact had not become larger than the Concordance. That had never been the real threat. It had become viable. And viable alternatives were what old systems feared most, because they turned dissatisfaction into choice. Naomi folded her hands behind her back. "Where's Lena?" Rook touched her slate. "Talari Route Station in the Marrow Belt. Meeting with 3 non-aligned corridor councils and a representative from the old Keln arbitration houses. Can she be reached?" "She can." Slowly. Naomi thought for a moment. "Not long. Long enough. Send her this," she said. "No instruction. No recommendation. Just the message." Rook hesitated. "You don't want to frame it?" "No," Naomi said. "If the Concordance finally wants to talk, it should talk to the person who made itself impossible to ignore without firing a shot." The message went out 6 minutes later. It would take time to find Lena. Everything still took time out here. That was another thing isolation had taught humanity. Slowness was not always weakness. Sometimes slowness was how you made sure the next move belonged to you. On Iller Prime, meanwhile, the Hall of Accord remained open, luminous, and increasingly tense. Reports later reconstructed the mood in fragments. Senior delegates arriving early and leaving late. Unscheduled caucuses. Interrupted meals. 3 separate attempts by the Transit Harmonization Office to produce a summary proving the Compact's influence remained regionally limited, all of which failed on the same point. The Compact was no longer regional in any meaningful administrative sense. It had routes in 31 systems. Recognized exchange agreements with 19 species outside original Concordance structures. Medical protocols now being quietly requested by member civilizations who had spent generations pretending no serious work happened beyond official channels. The old language, anomaly, fringe block, temporary coalition, was starting to sound foolish even to the people still using it. And once an institution begins to hear foolishness in its own voice, change is no longer a matter of if, only of cost. 17 days after the Venn Collective's inquiry, the first direct message arrived. Not public. Not formal. Not brave enough for that yet. It came through a private secretariat relay, encrypted and unmarked except for the authorization string that identified it as authentic. Addressed to Ambassador Lena Vale in absentia diplomatic file, suspended status. The message itself was only one sentence. If Earth is prepared to discuss stabilization, the Concordance is prepared to listen. When Naomi received the intercept copy aboard the Bastion, she read it once and placed it flat on the table. Rook, standing opposite her, said nothing. After a while, Naomi spoke. "Interesting wording." "Yes. They still think this is about Earth." Rook allowed herself the smallest nod. "Do you want me to draft a response?" Naomi looked again at the sentence. Prepared to discuss stabilization. Prepared to listen. The old instinct of power. Still trying to frame retreat as management. Still hoping to re-enter the story as the adult in the room. At last she slid the message back across the table. "No," she said. "Lena answers this one. And for the first time since the Hall of Accord had voted to teach humanity its place, Naomi felt certain of something larger than survival. The Concordance was no longer deciding what happened next. It was waiting to be told. Lena Vale returned to the Hall of Accord 4 years after walking out of it. The chamber had not changed. That was the first thing she noticed. The same black reflective floor. The same pale memory glass walls. The same impossible height above, where light gathered in quiet layers and made every delegate look slightly smaller than they intended to seem. The Concordance had built the room to remind its members that institutions outlasted people. It had not anticipated that people might return and alter the institution instead. She entered through the main diplomatic arch this time, not as a suspended representative under courtesy rules, not as a tolerated inconvenience from a minor species, but as chief negotiator for the compact delegation. That fact alone had forced architecture to adjust. 12 new stations had been installed along the lower semicircle of the chamber floor, each one equal in height and line of sight to the older member podiums. No elevated annex. No observer gallery. No combined representation bench tucked politely into the outer rings. Equal stations. Equal access. Equal voice. There had been fierce arguments over that before her arrival, she knew. Months of procedural resistance, design review disputes, symbolic objections disguised as structural concerns. The Concordance had eventually relented for the same reason old powers usually relented. Because by the time they were willing to negotiate, they no longer had enough leverage to make insult look like tradition. Lena paused only once before stepping fully into the room. Not because she was overwhelmed. Because she remembered. She remembered the 13th time she had stood there and asked what they called a people whose language they had never bothered to hear. She remembered the silence that followed. The elegant brutality of 32 species agreeing that deafness, when institutionalized, counted as wisdom. Now 12 of the peoples they had overlooked, delayed, minimized, combined, or classified into irrelevance had their own stations on the floor. The room had not changed. The room had been corrected. Across the chamber at the Concordance negotiating table, sat High Coordinator Saran Tal, not Selvek, whose retirement had been announced with suspicious speed 18 months earlier, but a younger official selected precisely because he had not personally authored the decisions that now required unwinding. He wore the controlled expression of a man who understood he had inherited a fire from elders who had spent too long calling it procedure. He rose as Lena approached. "Ambassador Vale," he said. "Coordinator." He glanced, just briefly, toward the new lower stations where the compact delegates were settling into place. Trinsal of the route houses. Representative Eska for the Talari Corridor Councils. A call legal speaker whose species had once been marked provisional for so long they had started using the word as a curse. 3 compact medical and transit delegates. 2 signatories from systems that had never held recognition in any official hall before this one. And at the far left station, a prism-lit vessel filled with pressure-stabilized water where the Athari representative glowed in slow, shifting wavelengths translated across a live sensory mesh. The Concordance had wanted to negotiate with Earth. What it had received was history arriving with witnesses. Saran gestured toward the central table. "We are prepared to discuss reintegration terms." Lena did not sit. For a moment, neither did anyone else. Then she said very calmly, "No." The word crossed the chamber with startling clarity. Saran's expression remained professionally composed, but only professionally. The room around them adjusted almost imperceptibly, the way powerful institutions did when they realized the opening line they had rehearsed would not survive first contact. "I beg your pardon," he said. Lena opened the slim paper folder she had carried with her and placed 3 documents on the table between them. "You are prepared," she said, "to discuss Earth's return to a system that tried to solve moral embarrassment through administrative erasure. You are prepared to restore route access, relay access, trade standing, medical licensing, and every other practical mechanism that became useful again once we proved we could live without them." She slid the first document forward. "I am not here for Earth's seat back." That sentence hit harder than volume ever could have. Around the chamber, attention tightened. The older delegates looked still. The newer ones did not bother pretending. Saran lowered his eyes to the page. "What then are you here for?" Lena slid the second document forward. 12 full recognitions for the signatory peoples currently represented by the Compact who have never held standing under Concordance law despite meeting every meaningful threshold for sovereignty, continuity, and interspecies engagement. The second page contained the list. Not presented as a plea. As an inventory of delay. Turin's route houses. The Talari councils. The call combined. 3 outer medical enclaves previously classified as transit adjunct entities. 2 corridor peoples labeled economically non-central. The Athari, whose dead had started all of this and who until now did not exist officially as persons at all. Saran looked up slowly. 12 full recognitions, he repeated. Yes. That is not a reinstatement package. That is structural expansion. It is correction. A silence moved through the chamber. Not the old silence. Not the one that followed dismissal and hid behind certainty. This silence was calculation. Saran touched the 3rd document. And this? Lena's expression did not change. That, she said, is 26 words. He read them in the diplomatic copy. No member polity may classify another people as lesser-minded, pre-civil, non-sapient, or developmentally insufficient except by jointly reviewable standards. Burden of proof rests with the classifier, never the classified. He read it again. And Lena, watching him, thought that this was the real difference between humiliation and leverage. Humiliation asks to be seen. Leverage asks to be counted. Charter amendment, Saran said quietly. Yes. That requires a supermajority. Then count. He met her eyes then. Really met them for the first time since she entered. You speak as though the outcome is already decided. Lena folded her hands. No, she said. I speak as though the decision no longer belongs entirely to this table. That was the truth of it. The Concordance had asked for quiet talks because it wanted to solve a legitimacy crisis privately. But legitimacy had already moved beyond private repair. The Compact's routes carried goods the Concordance now quietly depended on. Its medical exchanges were active in 6 member systems under discrete temporary authorizations. 5 formal delegates had already signaled support for review expansion. 4 more had promised nothing, which in politics often meant they were waiting to see whether courage would become convenient. And beneath all that sat the simpler fact that everyone in the room now knew. The Concordance had tried exclusion. Exclusion had produced an alternative. Alternatives, once viable, changed negotiations forever. The debate lasted 4 months. Not 4 clean months. 4 bitter, procedural, exhausting months full of private caucuses, jurisdictional arguments, symbolic disputes, transit reviews, language committees, tactical abstentions, and exactly the sort of slow institutional friction Lena had spent years learning to read. She did not make one grand argument. She made 23 specific ones. To the Venn collective, she spoke of precedent and survivability. To the Hest, corridor dependence and medical reciprocity. To the mid-tier trade blocks, she laid out in exact numbers what the Compact now moved through long path space without Concordance aid. To the reformists, she spoke of legitimacy decay. To the frightened, she spoke of what happened when systems became incapable of hearing minds that had not designed them. To one ancient delegate who insisted the Concordance must preserve coherence above all else, she said, then stop defining coherence as whatever already resembles you. Outside the chamber, cargo moved. Convoys ran. Shipyards built. No one paused history while the old order reconsidered itself. That helped more than any speech could have. By the time the final charter vote arrived, the chamber no longer felt like it had 4 years earlier. Not kinder exactly. Institutions did not become kind because someone argued well enough. But it felt less certain of its own innocence, and that was close enough to progress that Lena allowed herself to respect the difference. The amendment passed. Not unanimously. That would have felt dishonest. 24 in favor. 6 against. 3 abstentions. Enough. The 12 recognitions followed in the week after, each one a separate proceeding entered into the memory glass record with full status language, jurisdictional rights, route standing and representation guarantees that could no longer be quietly folded away under convenience. The Athari recognition was entered last. At Lena's request. When the clerk finished reading the final correction into the chamber record, the sensory mesh beside the Athari vessel translated a slow cascade of light into the nearest equivalent available in trade tongue. We note that the room has begun to hear. No one spoke for several seconds after that. Not because no response existed. Because some sentences deserved the courtesy of landing fully. After the final session, the delegates began to file out in clusters of relief, calculation, annoyance, and new ambition. The chamber emptied the way all chambers did, not with grandeur but with schedules. Assistants gathering papers. Translators disconnecting. Secondary meetings forming before the primary one had emotionally concluded. Lena remained near the entrance a little longer. Behind her, the amended charter plaque had already been installed beside the wall, 26 words in Concordance Standard and 12 additional translation bands waiting below for local renderings. She heard footsteps and turned. Naomi Sato stood there in formal civilian dark, hands in the pockets of a coat she clearly disliked wearing. "You stayed," Lena said. "I wanted to see if they actually put the plaque up." They did. Naomi looked past her toward the chamber floor and the 12 new stations. "Well," she said at last, "that's inconvenient for a lot of people." Lena laughed softly. "Yes." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, looking at the room. Then Naomi said, "Are we done?" Lena followed her gaze to the new stations, the altered geometry, the old chamber forced to learn a different balance. "No," she said. "Now we get to find out whether what we changed can remember why it was changed." Naomi nodded once, as if that was the only answer she would have trusted. Below them, on the black reflective floor, workers were already adjusting lighting positions around the new compact stations, making sure their sight lines matched the originals exactly. Good, Lena thought. Exactness mattered. Not because symmetry was sacred. Because power noticed where rooms placed people. She rested one hand briefly against the cool wall beside the entrance and thought of the day she had walked out under suspension, carrying anger so cold it had felt almost like direction. It had been direction. Just longer than she knew. When she and Naomi finally turned toward the corridor, the memory glass above them continued its slow, impossible work, storing voices, votes, corrections, and the fact that a room built to make everyone feel small had, at last, been forced to make space. And outside that room, far beyond the formal lanes and polished floors and amended charters, the long routes remained open. That, more than anything, was what made the ending honest. The old system still existed. The new one still moved. And because both were now real, neither would ever again mistake itself for the whole of the galaxy.